don't worry, we have the settings set up so that it will only record those of us who are unmuted and speaking. So as long as you stay muted, you will not be part of that recording and picked up for posterity. Please do use the chat box at any point in the evening to ask any questions that you have. Ask your questions and in the chat, and Davith and I will save them up and pose them for you at the end of the evening. And then last of all, before we introduce our special guest this evening, a quick note of thanks to all of you. This has been a long and hard year for independent businesses. We're still here, we're still standing, and that is due to the loyalty and support of all of our wonderful customers. So thank you for that ongoing support. We really couldn't be doing this without you. And now Davith is going to take it away with introducing our guests.
Thanks so much, Rachel. Well, tonight we're really in for a very special event. Elizabeth Wilcox is here with her new book, The Long Tale of Trauma. Elizabeth is an author, writer, and producer of youth and adult learning content. She has worked as a journalist in England and Hong Kong and the US, and she's extensive experience both nationally and internationally as a newspaper columnist, radio presenter, television news producer, and web producer. Her first book, The Mom Economy, was called one of the best career books of 2003. Her new book, The Long Tale of Trauma, is a family memoir about the generational effects of inherited trauma. Best-selling author Susan Conley said that this is a fascinating journey into the many ways in which inherited trauma wires us. We're very lucky to be joined today by our Erica Doyle. Born into Brooklyn to Trinidadian immigrant parents, her debut collection of poetry, PROXY, won the Norman Farber First Book Award for the Poetry Society of America and was a finalist for the Lambda Literary Award. Her current project, A Dreadful Mortality, explores genealogy, revolution, and intergenerational healing. Her work has been published in various journals and anthologies, including Best American Poetry, Our Caribbean, A Gathering of Gay and Lesbian Writing, and Bum Rush the Page, a Deaf Poetry Jam. Please join me in welcoming to Northshire Live, our Erica Doyle and Elizabeth Wilcox.
Well, thanks so much for having us here. This is so exciting, and I'm so psyched to be here with Erica as well, who is just an amazing person.
Thank you, everyone. It's also great to be here and to see so many friends, old and new. Thank you, everyone, for coming out, and I'm so glad we were able in these really trying times to be here together from many different parts of the country and from our lives. I'm really looking forward to this conversation, and thanks to everyone and to Elizabeth in particular for inviting me.
So we were thinking, we had this little conversation before, we were thinking I might begin by reading a little passage, and then I'll sort of turn it over to Erica, who's also a principal of a school and very, very informed and just a kind of a great leader in general. So I thought I'd begin maybe with just a brief passage, which kind of sets the tone, I think, of my work. It's as any of you who have read it, this book is really about mothers and daughters and inherited trauma. And it's about the impact of adverse childhood experiences on people who've experienced that, and also the people who follow them. And this scene I'm going to read is Anna, who gave birth to Violet illegitimately. And then her daughter was kind of pulled from her, raised by two spinster aunts until the age of 6, at which point she claimed her daughter back. And her daughter had been in a sort of middle class or upper middle class British home. And then she brought her daughter back into East End of London. And Anna is German, and Violet, her daughter, had grown up basically to age 6, thinking she was this upper middle class Brit. And suddenly she's brought into this German home with a Jewish German stepfather in really in kind of abject poverty. And so this is Anna, Bethnal Green, London, 1910. Violet's acceptance of her new life took longer than Anna had hoped. That first year, there were so many times when Violet would have an outburst over the most innocuous of things, a lost sock, too many nuts on her cake. Violet's little face would flush and she would scream or run from her mother, as if in need of an escape. At such times, Lewis would shrug, knowing better than to get involved. Let her be, he would say, when Violet was particularly uncontrolled. And in time, Violet would return, composed as if nothing had transpired between them, the past forgotten again. Give her time, Lewis would say, for as composed as Violet often was, both Anna and Lewis could see that Violet's forbearance was a thin armor to the struggle within her. So Anna waited, always reminding herself that her daughter no doubt missed her home in Rickmansworth, her pampered life, the attention and sense of belonging she once got. She reminded herself that her daughter's attitude was to be expected, and that, in fact, given her change in circumstances, she was surprisingly restrained. Violet never commented on that single worn couch or the stench in the narrow stairwell that connected all 6 flats, or the brazen woman above who entertained loud men in her flat at all hours of the night. Yes, she did carry in her a persistent and silent refutation evident in almost all that she did, in the unexpected check of her small head in response to what Anna had thought was a benign remark, or in the stiff way she carried herself through the dirty streets to her overcrowded school. Admittedly, Anna sometimes found her daughter's aloofness difficult to bear, but she accepted what she saw for what she decided it had to be, a means for her daughter to cope. She tried not to feel hurt. She kept no records of the wrongs. Maternal love, she knew, was a love so different from all else, so vast and infinite, with no start and no end. It was a love that since her daughter's birth, she had carried in every cell of her body, and having Violet home in the flesh was a visible materialization of what had been so long held, eternal in space, divine in the true sense, patient and kind, protected and trusted, hoped and persevered, forgiving, just like they said.
Thank you. And one of the things that really struck me about this is, can you share with the audience who is Anna and who is Violet to you?
So thank you, Erica. Anna is my great grandmother, and Violet is my grandmother, who gave birth to my mother, Barbara.
Thank you. And can you tell us a little, I think what's so fascinating for me is just as a writer, thinking about the journey that you took to create this book. So could you tell us about that? How did you come, and how long was that journey, and how did it change along the way?
So I first, as I mentioned in the beginning of the book, I first started researching this book when I was in my 20s. I was living in London, and I was a journalist, and my mother often spoke of her past, and she didn't speak directly of it really until I got into my 20s, but it was something that was always present. And when you just sort of knew it was there. And so, and she had this story, which was quite compelling. It was a good tale. And so one day, to kind of get her off my back in a way, I said, okay, Mom, just record your story. And I thought, okay, I'll do something with it. And then over the next sort of 20 years, I kept on thinking, okay, I'm going to sit myself down and write this story because there's some very dramatic turns of event. And over this same period, my mother, who suffered quite a lot in her early childhood, as did her own mother, she started to bear those effects, and they were visible effects. So there are effects from basically adverse childhood experiences, from her being separated from her mother and abused when she was very young. And these effects, at first the doctors couldn't figure out what it was. And then one day she got a name for it, which was PTSD. And she suddenly, and that for her was kind of transformative, because she was given a label to something which she carried with her, which we all saw, which we all struggled with. I mean, she struggled with it, carrying it, and we struggled seeing it. And so then sort of at the end of this sort of 20-year period, the Trump administration implemented policies where children were being separated from their parents along the border. And my mother, by this point, was kind of apoplectic. She was just so upset about that and about other policies that were actually being put in place globally, and really, war and carried the effects of those sort of policies, and felt really strongly that these stories needed to be told, because we needed to start to talk about what happened to children when they are separated from their parents. And so she was fully supportive of me writing this work. Of course, it turned out a little bit differently than what maybe she had
always
anticipated for both me and her. And at the time too, I was working I was helping two organizations, one of which was a nonprofit, which is this wonderful nonprofit called the Lionheart Foundation, and they develop sort of social and emotional programs, both for children or for at-risk youth who live in residential centers, and also to work with incarcerated populations. So I was helping them move their content online. And then I was also working with another organization that worked in early childhood. So through that process, I learned a lot about the development of these early skills in children, and how important that early period is, and what happens when the children aren't given that, when they don't have people whom they can model from, or who model for them rather. What happens to their development of emotional competence? What happens when they don't attach to an adult? What happens when they don't learn to regulate, which is all that those early years are so essential. And so at the same time, while I was learning this, I had seen my mother. She was actually, much improved by that point, but I had seen the impact of that on her when she went through crisis herself in her adult years.
Mm-hmm. And I guess one thing I'm wondering is, what were some surprises that you found along the way as you were developing this story? Because one of the things that's really interesting to me, and where we really connected, was the amount of research that you did, amount of historical research, genealogical research, talking to relatives, your conversation with your uncle. I mean, it gets to a point where this story really snowballs so much, I couldn't stop reading it. I mean, I literally couldn't put it down. And this is no ordinary memoir. This is no historical, fiction. It's so incredibly compelling in how it draws together all these different strands. And it's also reads like a mystery. And so what are some things that for you were surprising, and how did your family, your mother in particular, kind of respond to the surprises or the unexpected moments or incidents or discoveries that you made?
Well, it was sort of a mystery that unraveled as I researched it. I like that you said it was a mystery. And it actually began for my mother and her brother. When my grandmother died, my uncle opened up her drawer and he found a letter that was written to her from her biological father, whom she had never met. And she apparently had asked him, "Can I come and meet you?" And he had responded, basically, he put her off. And it was at that point that my uncle and my mother discovered that their mother had been illegitimate. They'd never known that. And then I went on, and then we, with the help of my uncle, we sort of found out where she lived, an address where she lived. And then I did some research over that. And I found that she lived in the East End. And again, my mother had never known. She'd always been told by her mother that her mother had this like happy childhood and said nothing else. And then my mother just, found out that she lived in abject poverty. And I continued to discover things. For one, I discovered that 6 months after my grandmother's father, the one who wrote the letter, had received the letter, he actually committed suicide. And we couldn't believe it, my mother and I.
Wow.
And, we'll never know why he committed suicide. It could have been just because it was coming out of the depression. One doesn't know. So one has to invent a little bit there as well. But so what I did is I tried to take facts that I discovered and I tried to piece it together. And I also tried to piece together just some of the different perceptions. So my mother would say that her mother could turn on a dime. She had a very quick flash of a temper, and yet the woman who looked after me knew my grandmother, because she had looked after my grandmother before she came to the States. She was Swiss German, to help my mother help my mother care for me and my six siblings. And she would say that my grandmother was really easygoing and absolute joy. And, how could I reconcile these two different versions of my grandmother, whom I never knew? So I had to kind of invent a little bit there of by piecing things together. And something you and I talked about, Erica, was in telling this story, I really wanted to not just talk about the events, but talk about the emotions and the feelings, and get into the heads of these characters. So of course, as you mentioned, that's fiction, but I really wanted to look at the lens of history and say, okay, what were the repercussions of those events in history? And to really look at the repercussions. For example, if we're talking about World War II and men on a battlefield and they lose their arm, well, what's happening to the women and children not on the battlefield? What's the result? What are those invisible scars that they're carrying with them, and that they may even pass on to the next generation? So that I wanted to explore that.
And I think what's so remarkable about what you're saying is that I feel that this book really zooms in. So we've got these huge historical events. I mean, there's literally an escape in the night from Holland, and under cover of night, and on the beach, and can they get on the ship? And they're going on the ship, and then they have to get off the ship. Who's going to get away? Who's not? How are they going to find who's left behind? I mean, it's just this, and this is all happening on the backdrop of World War II, and for your great-grandmother, World War I. And so we have, what is the impact on one family of the events of these enormous human-created tragedies? And so we're seeing a story that we don't see almost ever, a family, and focusing on the women. So for you, what was important about focusing on specifically the story of the women and the children? Why was that important? And what are some things, how did that connect to the work you were doing with Lionheart and your own relationship with your mother?
Well, as I mentioned before, I think that the stories that we read, and I actually studied American literature in college, and most of the stories in history is told, I feel, from a male perspective. It's the battles, it's who we see as the decision makers and what's happening at that table for negotiating peace, or we don't hear the stories of the women, as much, and the women who are in a lot of these situations, most often in the past, the ones who are primary caregivers for the children, and then what's the impact of those events in history on this relationship between the mothers and the children. And I think that, you look at, I mentioned this in my book, you look at, there have been studies done on rats and female maternal mother rats. And those women have endured stress and trauma and developed behaviors. And in their female pups, they show some of those same behaviors that are a result of the trauma that the mother bore. So what happens is the trauma turns on the expression of a gene, and then that's passed on. And So I think we really need to think about the repercussions of that. But, at the same time, I don't think, as we discussed, this is not all doom and gloom. I think that a friend of mine, Beth Kasarjian, who actually is one of the people who works at the Lionheart Foundation, she said something to me, which is, what is harmed through trauma can be healed. I'm sorry, what is harmed through relationship can be healed through relationship. And so we also have to remember that relationship can heal as well as harm.
Yes.
And so because somebody's experienced trauma and they carry these effects and they wear this mask of trauma, and some of those effects can be transmitted or passed on, it doesn't mean that those are fixed, and they can be healed. And I think particularly now, given where we are too, and coming out of this crisis as we are, we have to remember that. And that to me is really important.
Yes. I think this conversation about healing is an essential one. And one of the themes that I try to explore in my work is not only really looking at intergenerational trauma and genealogical history in my family. It's from the Caribbean. We're product of all the revolutions that began in the French islands. Haiti was the only one that was successful. And so part of my family that were people of color escaped from the suppression of their revolution by the British to Trinidad. And then the other part were white plantation owners who were French, who were escaping the rebelling enslaved people, and they ran to Trinidad too, right? So we have these complex histories, and there are reasons why things are passed down or beliefs or attitudes held in our family. And certainly the horrors that people experience as a result of these events, incidents, and especially women who in many of these societies have a lot less power and have to negotiate for power very carefully in all these different ways, right? A lot of times through their relationships with men, and then really trying to figure out what their roles, responsibilities, and expectations are around children and how they come to personhood with that. And I think what's really powerful in this story is that we do see what were the strategies that women used to cope, what were the strategies the children used, and then what was protective? What were the protective factors? Like the spinster aunts, it's very important. For example, the adverse childhood experiences, we know it's really important to have just one caring adult in a child's life. That can make a huge difference towards their healing, no matter what's happened to them. And there are certainly other protective factors, like a safe environment, like a school can give to children. So one thing I'm wondering is, can you tell us about the healing that we see in the book, or even the healing strategies that we see people embodying, and how they use those healing strategies to make each generation just a little bit better?
Yeah, so it was, people often will say, well, I can't believe you wrote this memoir while your mother was still alive. And my mother had to be incredibly courageous and brave, which she was, to kind of allow me to write this book. And actually, and then in the actual reading of this book as well, I had tended to read it to her when she was having hip surgery and COVID happened, and I read it to her over the phone. And she was actually super strong with it, and I was the one who was kind of a mess. And I think in a way, the fact that I often don't depict her well, but I often don't depict myself well. And I wanted to show this sort of arc, in the beginning, I am definitely a petulant 20-something. And there are times throughout that span where I'm probably, you're not necessarily going to finish this book liking me at all. I wanted to show the struggle that I had relating and understanding, and also show the importance of developing empathy and and being able to see past this mask of trauma to the core self and show that I often struggled with that. So I wanted to, in a way, kind of normalize that. And so, I have these two narrative ones, which is the historic narrative, and one which is kind of a present day narrative. And I wanted to show how one was impacting the other, but also how in the present day, I could eventually come to terms with the historic one. And so I hope that somebody finishes this work feeling like that we all can struggle, people who carry trauma and people who love and care for people who carry trauma, but at the same time that empathy and working to try to better relate and empathize with those we love.
One of the things I really admired was, having that difficult relationship with your mother. And I was in the book, you keep saying that, but I think you actually come off pretty, in your 20s, you sound like a regular 20-year-old. And I think we as readers can really empathize with our mother driving us crazy, or some relative who drives us crazy, because from a primal place, from a place where there's something that's really unresolved for us. And one of the things I really remarked on in the book is how you develop this self-talk to reach your mom. That I feel really uncomfortable, but I have a consciousness of what's going on. And even though she's doing this, I'm going to try to do this step towards my mother.
And I also, what was important to me, I also wanted, I talk about parenting as well, because, we can turn that lens, and I can look at my children and know that self-talk's probably occurring with them at the same time, right? Or that need for self-talk because I'm driving them crazy, or I'm doing this wrong. And in the beginning of the book, I say how, when I first gave birth to my child, I was like, I'm going to be the perfect parent. And I was so offended when the nurse told me that I was going to make a lot of mistakes. And I was like, come on, I got this. And then that sort of evolution as you as a parent, where you think this is actually not that easy. And actually my mother did a good job, and my mother did a good job, and look what she came from. Look what I've been given, I better step up here. And yet I still make mistakes.
Sure.
So it's trying to kind of turn that lens in both directions.
So I have to say my video is going on and off because my computer is kind of having allergies or something. But that's all that's going on. So one thing I guess I was, wondering in terms of, we talked about this as writers, about that armor and about the necessity of believing in the possible. Could you talk about that believing in the possible and what place it takes in your book, and also what place it has for you?
Yeah, so it's something, this kind of goes back to what is harmed through relationship can be healed through relationship. And so the same person, Dr. Kasarjian, my friend Beth, had said, always says to me, your mother missed so much. She was age 3 years old. Basically, she had no childhood. She was looking after, for those of you who haven't read my book, my mother was put on a train when she was 3 years old in something called Operation Pied Piper, where the British government decided they had to keep the British children safe. So they put them onto these trains up into the north of England. Some of them actually went across the ocean, and a lot of them actually were bombed and didn't even make it across. My husband's father was one of those put on a boat to go to the United States, and he was with a good family in the end. But my mother was age 3, her brother was age 1.5, and she ended up in this home in Wales where they were abusive, and then another home. It was just all a very terrible situation. And then by the time her mother was released, she had been interned in Holland. By the time she gets back, my mother was so resentful and angry, and she couldn't accept her as her mother. And her mother didn't know what to do with her. So these children in Operation Pied Piper, basically they did a study of the children, the females who had been put on these trains, and they found out that close to half of them in later life were at level 2 depression or greater. And that separation in those early years had really impacted them very deeply. And so going back to what my friend said, she said that, what is harmed through relationship can be healed through relationship. So your mother must have had somebody in her life. And she did. She had a number of people. And in my childhood, my father was this very optimistic person. And you talk about what is possible. I mean, the thing that my father struggled with most when he was dying, because he had this heart condition where the doctor said to him, "You are going to die." And my father couldn't accept that because he was always an optimist. There was always something better around the corner. And I think maybe with my mother, being paired with my mother, that contrast, where maybe she saw possibility with him, that things can get better, things will get better. I don't know. I can't really speak to their relationship, but at the same time, they were both devoted, very different people in many ways, but very devoted.
And can you tell us about your relationship with your mother and how you saw her? Because I think what's really interesting is the ways you're able to see your mother, when you talk about her going to the country club in the bikini,
Yeah.
and then when she's in England, she's kind of being a petulant child, as you described yourself to be.
Yeah.
And then now, as really somebody who is really a voice for justice, and but also being very self-reflective. And I guess I'm just wondering, it can be very difficult for us to accept our parents in all these different ways.
Yeah.
How were you able to do that? What do you still struggle with around that?
So my mother, she was, or she always has been unafraid to voice what she thinks ever since she was a small child. And she is, she's just very strong. I mean, for example, Southern Poverty Law Center, she always keeps that on her fridge, like any map that they put up of, where the hate crimes are. I mean, she gets really, she is just adamant, and a real, just can't stand injustice. And she's always been, when I remember once when I was very young, she had these friends and they were gay and they came and they stayed in our house, and she put them in the same room. And, at the time when I was young, people were like, "Oh my gosh, what's going on? I can't even believe this."
We didn't even have Maury Povich then, right?
Men in the same room, in the same bed, what's she doing? And she just, for her, she doesn't like to see, she just doesn't, it's a part of who she is. And it's something I really admire about her. She's got very strong convictions, and even with, this whole Prince Harry and Meghan Markle, she calls me up afterwards. "I'm so glad they did what they did. They needed to do that. Someone needed to say something about Britain and society there and what's going on." She's still is a very strong advocate. It's that's really refreshing and always has been. And then on the top of that, as a mother, she's always provided unconditional support and love for us. I mean, in terms of, I believe you can achieve this. And I think it's part of the reason why she's been okay with the publication of this book, because she's unconditional in her love and she's a supporter and she wants me to be successful, even if she takes a hit.
Thank you. Well, we have so many interesting questions from the audience. I was wondering, Dafith and Rachel, if you all wanted to start taking those, because they're really amazing. Aside from all of our friends saying how much they love you.
Right. I love Elizabeth at every age.
I know. Now I even feel guilty. I was like, oh, maybe I don't want to elicit, like, I'm not here to elicit praise for myself.
No? Too bad. But Amber has a really great
Yeah.
question.
So
So we
I-
have some really
I-
great
I
questions.
think that's a really good question. Amber says, I'd love to hear more about how Elizabeth's extended immediate family reacted to this book. Did they feel exposed? Are they grateful to have some of their family history wrapped up in one book? I think grateful is probably the short answer, no. I think that, I think my family, I have 6 brothers and sisters, 5 of them were, we're really pretty good with the book. I think one of my siblings felt like, to your point, that he did feel exposed, that, you know, I'd sort of aired the dirty laundry. And but he sort of worked through it, I think. Um, and then in terms of other family, it's interesting actually. I've had cousins on my father's side really feel they like the window into my father, because he's in it a short amount, but he's in it. He was a very strong influence in my life, and they see reflected in my father their own fathers, which was kind of neat and interesting, and similar relationships between their father and their mother, i.e. their fathers ended up with people not unlike my mother. So that's a whole nother path to explore, but that has been interesting actually.
You know, that reminds me of the gentleman that you said, you know, the reaction of the public to your book, and to the man who it reminded him of his past. Can you talk about some of the reactions that you've gotten from other people?
So it's actually been, it was very stressful publishing this book because it's so exposing, and mostly exposing of my mother. So I felt very conflicted in a lot of ways, and I didn't want to hurt my mother at all. And of course, my mother's super strong, so she's taken it on the chin, as they say. But what's been really, in all of that, what's been really gratifying for me is the number of emails and responses I've got from people who are either the children of parents who have experienced some sort of trauma, and they have told me in a way, in not in different words, but in lots of different words, but for them it's been very normalizing for them. They sort of understand their parent more from a new perspective, and that for me has been really wonderful. And then the other thing is, I've had people write me and say that they actually understand themselves a little bit more. I had one father of a friend of mine write her, he read it and said, I've never really thought about the fact that I was separated from my mother from age 7. And now I actually can see how it's impacted me. And it's amazing to me that he'd never actually thought about it until that point. And then he said, thank Elizabeth for writing this book. And so for me, you know, as my husband says to me sometimes, because I do get the people who feel like, I had somebody say, oh, this book suggests that Elizabeth's whole life is trauma, which was not what I was trying to say, you know. But you hear that, you're like, oh gosh. But anyway, my husband Lucian said to me, you know, if you impact just a few people and can connect to them, it's a worthwhile thing to have done, you know.
Yeah, I think what's really remarkable about this is that it's not the fact that your whole life is trauma. It's the fact that most of your life is not. However, you had a parent who were impacted by wars, patriarchy, classism, and that impacted generations after. It's not a moment. It's not something you just get over. Like this man who writes you in his 70s and says, you just taught me something about myself. Because when those things happen, when we experience trauma and it's unresolved, we cannot fully be in relationship with other people because we can't fully be in relationship with ourselves. Mm-hmm. And imagine a world where we could be fully in relationship with each other and with ourselves.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Exactly.
So we've got another question. Oh, did it writing about your family's generational trauma feel cathartic? And do you feel you changed your family's narrative?
I hope so. I don't, cathartic, I think is probably too strong a word, in that I feel I feel that having written it, a lot of it is painful. But I think that what it did do is, I can tell you, I'm never writing such a personal book again. I feel like I listened to Susan Connolly, this friend of mine, who kindly read the book and gave me a nice little quote at the cover. And she was talking to Richard Russo, who I think is a wonderful writer. And she wrote I think it was maybe her first or second book was a memoir. And she said, okay, I'm done with memoirs. She just come out with this book, Landslide, that's doing incredibly well. And she's like, it's not memoir, I've done the memoir. And I feel in a way that it kind of, the genie's out of the bottle now and I can move forward now. So I suppose in that sense, it's cathartic. In terms of, Alicia says here, did you think you changed the narrative going forward with your family and how they all deal with trauma in the future? I hope it's changed the narrative a little bit in terms of my mother, I hope, even though there are aspects of her that is this mask of trauma, you know, this sort of, sometimes her struggle with her mental health in terms of, you know, getting depressed or you know, regulating. I think at the same time, it's like getting a PTSD diagnosis. It's like, it's validating. And I hope she recognizes that, and I tell her, I hope probably not enough though, that she's been a great parent, and that this core of her unconditional self, you know, that is what matters, and that is what we care about, and that is who we love. So I'm hoping that part of the narrative for her and for other people who have parents or have loved ones who have experienced trauma, that the narrative changes in that way. I see another question. Can you speak a little more about the genetic component in generations bearing their ancestors' wounds? That trauma turns on the expression of a gene thing. Yeah, so it's really interesting. You know, there's this whole, you know a lot about it, I'm sure, Erica, and anybody who's a psychologist in this audience will know much more than me. But you know, there's this thing called epigenesis, where there's the influence of society and of kind of environment, rather, an influence of environment versus what you're genetically given. And there's this interplay between the two. And it's the best I can explain it, because I was trying to find the words for it, is that literally trauma can change the expression of a gene. So you may never have been somebody who hoarded, for example, but because of what you went through, you hoard. And what's changed is that you had that propensity in you. You had that might have come out, but this trauma turned it on. And once it's turned on, you can pass it on, turned on, to your daughter. Actually, it's much more prevalent in daughters than sons when they looked at those female rat pups versus male rat pups. And I don't know, maybe they've discovered why that is now since then. But when I read the research, it hadn't been discovered. And so actually, you know, even understanding it more, you know, when Darwin came out with his theory on evolution, and then there was this other guy who I guess really tried to talk much more about environment and its influence, and he was kind of laughed off the stage. And now they've come back and they said, well, actually, no, environment does have something to do with it. So, yeah.
That reminds me of one of the really amazing things that my wife, who's a midwife, taught me or told me, which is that a grandmother holds not only her child in her, but also all of the eggs that child will ever have. So it's like we've actually experienced those things in utero, which is, I think, one of those amazing things. But there's another question here from the audience that got missed, which was from Marcy. She says, why was it so important to come out with this book now? Were you thinking of your mom? You wanted her to understand more about you?
So that's a good question, Marcy. And Marcy's actually a friend of mine. Hi, Marcy. I actually, what I kind of alluded to earlier was, when I was at the time working in these two environments, both of which were kind of social and emotional learning programs, applied in different ways. And so really starting to understand the importance of early childhood, and when you don't get that kind of nurturing that you need when you can't attach to a primary caregiver, the impact of that. So having that understanding, and then set against what was happening politically at the time, which was, these children being separated at the border, what was happening in Syria, these children really being impacted, as Erica said, by things so outside of their control, but that we humans were doing to them. It was terrible. And my mother was just, she's very politically engaged, and she was also just really upset. And I thought, okay, what skill do I have? I can write, and I have this knowledge and that I've learned through my work. And so now is the time for me to apply this. And in fact, after COVID broke, my publisher said, okay, I don't want to publish it until spring. So it was actually not, she was going to delay the publication by 6 months. And I felt like I had to get it out. Like I had to get it out before spring. I had to get it out in the fall, because there was just this imperative. We had to change our policies, and I had to do it. So that was why I stuck with it. And, I still look back in, and I could have done it after, maybe in 10 years after my mother's passed away, although I think my mother's going to live a long time. But I felt like the time was now.
I feel like it's also a gift to her. In terms of talking about the healing and how we can heal, it's a gift not only to your mom and to yourself and to your whole family, but to all of us. Because one of the things that we talked about is this really teaches us how we cannot dismiss the impact of these things, and we need to heal from them, and we need to prevent them, so that we don't have to keep healing from these preventable disasters.
Yeah. So as you speak, so Erica is brilliant and just an awesome person. Everybody who knows, so Erica went to high school with me, and she was I always think of her as this person who bounced around carrying joy with her. And still is that person. She carries this joy, right? But you've had your challenges with your family history as well, but you still hold on to that joy. And so Erica wrote me this note when I approached her to see if she would be willing to join this discussion. And she sent me this response, which kind of speaks to what you just said. And she says, I keep thinking about it and how your work zooms in and zooms out and centers people who have been subjected to circumstances beyond their control, which they survived, but which they and generations after were affected by. So it's about healing, but it's also about not having this happen in the first place. Neither of us are talking about hurricanes or earthquakes or volcanoes, but about human-created disasters, war, sexual assault, discrimination, and enslavement, whose harm lasts for generations. So I think about the healing, and then I think about how we are trying to create a world where the traumatic events within our human control happen less and less. I think about the empathy and conscious understanding of your book and how they are so essential. It helps us realize how these past events reverberate and how we can support ourselves and others, in all caps, heal, so we don't pass it on to future generations. And I think that's a nice response to Marcy's question in a way too.
Thank you.
There's also a question here from Caroline. She says, Elizabeth, how long did your writing and research process take?
Yeah, so that's kind of like, hello, Caroline. I know Caroline. I've got a few friends up here now, which is really nice. Caroline, so it's sort of how long is a piece of string in a way. I mean, so I think I went through different parts of my life. So in my 20s, when I first thought, oh, this is a really cool story, I felt like it was kind of Sophie's Choice when my grandfather was trying to escape from Holland, and he's got his wife who's on this stretcher, and they managed to get out onto the ship while Holland and Rotterdam's being blitzed, And anyway, I'm not going to ruin the story except to say that they ended up having to go back to the land. But before they were going back to the land, he had to make his decision as to, was he going to go down with his children on the ship, or down with his wife on the ship, or leave with his children, because his wife was in this stretcher. And he decided to go down on the ship with his wife and send his children to safety. But then he managed to escape. He reunited with his children. And then he had this second decision where he found one more ship to leave Rotterdam. And the captain said, we can't take your wife because she's on a stretcher. There's not room for her. And again, he had to decide, did he stay in Rotterdam with his wife, or did he leave with his children? And so this time he left with his children rather than stay with his wife. And I always felt like that was like a Sophie's choice for a father, and so that, for me, I was like, when I was in my 20s, I was like, oh, that's my story. That's the story I'm going to write. I'm a journalist. I want to write a story. And then, over those next 20 years, I had different periods where I was like, okay, I'm not writing this story. I've got to, move forward on my career. And then other points where I thought, okay, I'm going to write this story. But all along, I kept on writing and researching. So I think I've probably been working on this story off and on since I was about 22.
And I think there's something to that there are some stories that you actually need to grow into them.
Yeah, I think that's fair, actually. Oh, that's a good question. So Nancy Hughes says, on the matter of timing, it seems that it was critical also to not write this book too soon. So that's to what you just said, Erica, that Elizabeth had to become a parent, a mother, to be well-equipped to understand her mother more profoundly, to enter into empathy. And I think that's really fair. It's what I said earlier, is that while I was looking at my mother, I then had to turn that kind of mirror back onto myself and say, oh my goodness, I'm actually really struggling doing this with my kids, and my mother did it really well. So Elizabeth, don't be so harsh here. It is hard to be a mother, and it's hard to be a daughter, and it's hard to be a mother. And we have to understand both of those things are hard.
I actually have a question that's come up over the course of the conversation, which is, in doing your research for this book, did you start sort of seeing this phenomenon playing out in other families, like starting recognizing like, oh, this family in the news, or this family that I know about, this is what's going on with them?
Yeah, so I started thinking about it actually in so many different ways. I started thinking about it from like a larger collective trauma and construct too. So, if you think about generations of trauma, I mean, you have to think, you can't help but not think about, Black Lives Matter and what we as a society have done to certain groups, particularly people of color, and also other groups as well, and the implications of that, transgenerationally, and how we have to move somehow, reconcile and so I see it on this collective level all the time. And then likewise, I speak in the story. So my great grandfather, Louis, the one who I read the passage about, so he was German Jewish. And when he was in London at the outbreak of World War I, he was interned by the Brits. And then he gets sent back to London. He gets released from this Isle of Man camp.